Working in a morgue was never in my plans. It's not the kind of job you dream of as a child, but life led me down this path in a way that I didn't even understand. My name is Alejandro, and a few years ago I worked as an assistant in a small morgue in Mexico City. I wasn't a coroner or a doctor, just an assistant who did what he was asked. Moving bodies, preparing reports, cleaning, and sometimes assisting in embalming. I never imagined that one of those nights would leave me with a doubt that I will never be able to resolve. That night I was alone. My boss had left early and the morgue was completely silent, something that over time I learned to ignore. It's not the usual kind of silence, but a dense one that makes you feel like you're not really alone. I had received the body of a 42-year-old man a few hours ago. According to the report, his death had been due to a sudden heart attack, with no attempts at resuscitation, no signs of struggle, as if his body had simply stopped working. Nothing out of the ordinary. I had to prepare him for embalming. Before I put him in the cold room, it was a routine procedure until it wasn't. When I uncovered the body to begin the procedure, I felt a chill. It wasn't the cold of the place but something deeper. The face of the deceased had a serene expression, too serene. It was as if, rather than being dead, he was simply waiting. This wasn't something you saw in every body. Rigor mortis often distorts facial muscles, but this man had an eerie peace in his features. Almost as if he was still aware of what was going on around him. I told myself it was just my imagination and began to work. I laid out the instruments on the table, prepared the chemicals, and adjusted the hose to drain the fluids. But as I went along, something didn't feel right. At one point I looked away from the body to write in the report. When I looked back, it seemed to me that his head was in a slightly different position. I wasn't sure, maybe I had moved it without realizing it. I forced myself. Not thinking too much about it, I continued with my work, but when I turned to take the gloves, I was certain that the body had changed position. Again the chill came back stronger. I knew that the brain can play tricks on you in such places. After all, working among the dead is not something that the human mind assimilates easily. But this time it wasn't just a feeling, I was seeing it with my own eyes. I tried to go through the procedure without thinking about it anymore, but the atmosphere in the morgue became heavier, almost. As if there was someone else in the room, I glanced at the steel table, hoping to see the slightest movement, and then the light flickered. It was a quick flicker, just an instant, but in that brief moment when darkness invaded the room, I swear I saw something move on the stretcher. My skin crawled. I didn't want to continue working without understanding what was happening, so I decided to check the security cameras. I went to the computer and looked for the recordings of the last few hours. What I saw left me breathless. Every time I left the room or moved away, the body moved imperceptibly but enough to be obvious. Someone without experience could have attributed it to post-mortem reflexes, but I knew it wasn't that. At certain moments of the recording when I wasn't in the room, a blurry shadow leaned over the corpse. It wasn't a camera failure, it wasn't a reflection, it was a figure that shouldn't be there. I returned to the room with a feeling of oppression in my chest. I stood at the door watching the body, waiting for something to happen. The air felt thicker. And then the unthinkable happened. The corpse let out a sigh. Not a simple escape of gases, not an involuntary sound of decomposition. It was a real sigh, slow and deep, as if the man on the stretcher had just woken up. My legs went numb, my whole body was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I watched as his lips seemed to move slightly, as if he were trying to say something. There was no sound, just the unbearable cold of the room and that feeling of seeing something I shouldn't see, something that shouldn't be happening. I stepped away from the stretcher with my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to stay there a second longer. I took the reports and decided to leave the body in the cold room. I wanted to get away from him as quickly as possible. I closed the door with trembling hands and tried not to think about what I had seen. When my shift was over, I didn't say anything. There was no point in trying to explain it. The next morning, the coroner who took the shift reviewed the report, but while I was there, I was still in the cold. We were talking. He mentioned something that left me cold. He told me that the initial report of the deceased had inconsistencies. The man had not died of a heart attack as had been recorded. He had been declared dead without a proper autopsy. The real reason for his death was unknown. I was speechless for a moment, my mind clouded with a terrifying possibility. What if he was not really dead when we received him? But no, there was no way for anyone to breathe after being in refrigeration for hours. The only explanation. The logic was that something else was happening, something I was not supposed to understand. I never watched the recordings again, I never checked on that body again. I only know that when I returned to the morgue days later, the body was no longer there. They had sent it to his family without any further evidence, without any further explanation. But there is something that I have never gotten out of my head. When the corpse sighed that night, his expression was no longer serene, it was one of anguish, as if he had understood at that moment that he was trapped in a lifeless body. We continued. I have always been a person. Although I have always been interested in the paranormal and those ghost stories that people tell to scare each other or entertain themselves, as is my case, I have worked in a morgue for several years and, although at first it was hard for me to get used to the idea of being surrounded by corpses every day, over time everything becomes routine. The bodies arrive, are registered, stored, and finally they leave. It is part of the process, but there are things that sometimes break with that routine and make it clear to you that there is something beyond what we can understand. That night, everything was quiet. It was one of those long shifts in which tiredness begins to weigh more than usual. It was almost 11 when he received a transfer from the hospital. A man of about 50 years old who had died of a heart attack at home, a common case, nothing out of the ordinary. I took the papers, checked the data, entered the information into the system and proceeded to take the body to the cold storage, everything as usual until something made me stop. As I entered the data into the system, I saw that this man was already there. Since the day before, the same name, the same age, the same cause of death. My first thought was that someone had made a mistake, that maybe they had duplicated the data or that some other corpse had a similar name, but something inside me told me to check on my own. So I went to the chamber and looked for the compartment where this man's body was supposedly, and there it was. I opened the drawer and saw his face, his clothes, his ID card with the same name that I had just received. I slammed it shut and took a step back, trying to process what I was seeing couldn't be possible. I checked the papers again, looked at the records once more, everything matched, there were no mistakes. The body I had just received couldn't be there because this man had already arrived the day before. I returned to the office, feeling my hands sweating. I thought about calling someone, but what would I say that I had the same body twice? I forced myself to think rationally, to find some logical explanation, but the more I tried to find one, the less it made sense. All in all, I felt the need to check it again. Maybe I was tired. In some illogical way, I thought I saw something that wasn't there, so I went back to the camera, opened the drawer again and saw exactly the same thing. Then there was a blackout. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to make me feel a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the morgue. When the light came back, something made me look at the second drawer, the one with the newly admitted body. When I opened it, I couldn't breathe. It was a different body, it wasn't the same man. The clothes were different, the face was someone else's, the information on the label was completely different. I felt a sudden dizziness, as if my head couldn't process what I was seeing. I looked for the documents from the office and there were the data I had reviewed before, but now they didn't match up. I didn't know what to think. It couldn't be a mistake if I saw the body myself before the blackout. I checked the records with my own eyes. The file with the name of the first man no longer existed. The computer showed the data of the new body as if the other had never been there. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes, trying to calm myself. Something in my head told me to get out of there, not to try to make sense of what had just happened. I closed the drawer and returned to the office, feeling like I was in a bad dream, but it was all real. The next day, a veteran medical examiner noticed my condition and asked me if everything was okay. Without thinking too much, I told him what had happened, expecting him to make fun of me or find a way to make sense of me. I tried to find some logical explanation, but he didn't. He stayed silent for a few seconds, looking at me with a serious expression, and said something that I still can't forget. Sometimes when someone dies unexpectedly, their death doesn't settle immediately. It's as if their spirit doesn't understand that they've already left this world and is trying to repeat it. But reality itself corrects it. Words that left me frozen. They didn't make sense, but at the same time it was the only explanation that could fit with what I had lived since then. Every time I receive a body, I check the information twice. Every time I hear about someone who died alone at home, I wonder if their death was recorded in reality or if at some point someone else will have to repeat it. I never saw anything like it again, but that doesn't mean I stopped thinking about it. Maybe there are deaths that simply don't accept being definitive. Like and subscribe if you're enjoying it. We continue. I'm Diego and I've been working as a coroner in a small town morgue for almost a year. It's a job. Lonely, but I got used to it quickly. It's not like they paint it in the movies. Most of the time it's routine. Bodies arriving, reports to fill out, autopsies to do, and all in an atmosphere of absolute silence. It's a place where death is the only sure thing, or at least that's what I thought before what happened to me a few weeks ago. My boss told me that they were finally hiring a new morgue manager. I worked most of my shifts alone, and although the loneliness didn't bother me, there were nights when it felt heavier. It's normal to have someone else to share the night shift with. It didn't seem like a bad idea to me. I'll introduce you to him tomorrow so you don't think you're still talking to yourself. my boss said jokingly. I nodded and went on with my business. That night I had work pending on the computer. Overdue autopsy reports and a list of bodies that needed to be processed, the usual routine after 3 in the morning. As I finished writing a report, I saw someone pass by the hallway through my office window. It was a man. Medium height, thin, with a somewhat worn gray uniform. It seemed logical to me that he was the new mayor. I waved to him in greeting, but the man just stopped dead and stared at me. He didn't respond with a nod, or smile. He just watched me for a couple of seconds before turning the corner of the hallway and disappearing. I found his behavior odd, but I let it go. Maybe it was his first shift, and he wasn't in the mood to socialize. Not everyone comes in with the mood to talk, and in a place like silence is normal. When my shift ended, I thought nothing more of it. I went home as usual and slept without problems. I had no idea what I would discover the next day. When I arrived at the morgue the next night, my boss called me to introduce me to the new mayor. An older man with a friendly face approached and extended his hand with a smile. Nice to meet you, Diego. I hope we work well together. I nodded back out of politeness, but my mind was completely on something else. Something didn't fit. If he had just arrived. So here's Enoch in the hallway. I didn't say anything at the time, but a chill ran down my spine. I asked, trying to sound casual, if anyone else had been in the morgue overnight. My boss shook his head. No, there was no one else yesterday. Why? I didn't know what to answer. How to explain what I saw without sounding paranoid. In the end, I just said that I thought I saw someone, but it was probably my imagination. I tried to go through my shift without thinking about it, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. I needed one. So I decided to move up the reports and check the bodies awaiting autopsy. I went to the refrigerated chamber and opened one of the compartments, checking the list of names. When I looked at the body in the tray, my stomach sank. It was him, the same man I saw in the hallway, the same gray uniform, the same vacant expression, the same figure, but the worst part wasn't that. When I checked the label on his file, I realized something even more disturbing. That body had been there for several days. I felt the cold of the morgue even more intense. This couldn't be happening. I couldn't have seen him the night before if he had been in refrigeration for days. My head tried to find a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. I checked his cause of death, sudden heart attack. He had been found in his house, sitting in a chair, no longer showing vital signs. I slammed the tray shut and walked away from the camera. My heart was beating too fast, the feeling of vertigo was uncontrollable. I leaned against the wall and tried to calm myself down. Maybe it was just a coincidence, maybe I had seen. I saw someone similar in the hallway and my mind was playing with me. But then I remembered something. The look wasn't just seeing someone with the same uniform, the same build, the same face. I looked into his eyes, he looked at me, he was aware of my presence. The air in the morgue felt thick, as if the place had changed temperature from one moment to the next. My skin was cold, but at the same time I had a cold sweat on my forehead. I wanted to get away from there, but my legs wouldn't respond. I forced myself to check the man's files. I searched through the Informa until I found the exact time his body was admitted. He arrived 3 days earlier, not the night before. It couldn't have been him that I saw in the hallway, but I saw him, I greeted him, he looked back at me. For the first time in my life I felt a fear that I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the fact that I had seen a dead person wandering around, it was what it implied, because if he could stand there looking at me as if I were any other person, it meant that his consciousness still existed, that he was somehow still trapped in this place without understanding that. He no longer belonged to this world, but the worst of all is that he managed to make contact. It wasn't a simple shadow play or a reflection. He saw me and I saw him. We shared a moment that shouldn't have existed. From that day on I didn't talk about it again. I kept working, doing my shifts, trying to ignore the feeling that at any moment when I looked up I could see him again in the hallway. Weeks have passed and he hasn't appeared again, but every time I'm alone, I feel like someone is watching me. I don't know if his spirit finally understood that he no longer belongs to this world, or if he's still here, trapped somewhere between life and death. But if there's one thing I now know for sure, it's that the morgue isn't just a place where the dead are kept. Some presences just don't go away. We continue. My name is Daniel and I worked in the morgue of a small hospital for almost 6 years. It wasn't the job I dreamed of when I was a child, but life took me there and I ended up getting used to the routine in the end. Someone has to do it. At first it was a bit shocking, but over time I learned to see the corpses as simple records, not men on a sheet of paper who would soon be claimed by their families. They became routine. The corpses stopped seeming disturbing to me. They were inert bodies that were simply there, waiting for the next process. Most people imagine that the morgue is a gloomy place, full of macabre stories, but in reality it is a fairly peaceful environment. It is not a difficult job, it is just methodical and solitary, but there was one night when I understood that death can be more complicated than we think. And although I have tried to give it a logical explanation, there is something in the back of my mind that tells me that I will never find it. I have told this story only once, and it was to someone who didn't believe me, and I understood it, because I wouldn't have believed something like that if someone else had told me, but I lived it, I saw it with my own eyes. And even though the years have passed, there are nights when I still think about it. It was a shift like any other, quiet, with the hospital silent and only a few doctors and nurses on duty that night. I had to receive one more body, a 43-year-old man. According to the report, he died at home due to a domestic accident. The autopsy didn't show anything out of the ordinary, so all I had to do was finish the paperwork and move him to the cold storage room. I did everything as always. I checked the data, checked to prepare it. I don't know when exactly I started to notice that something was out of place. At first it was a strange feeling, as if someone else alive was with me in the room, but I was alone in the room. I thought it was tiredness, but then, when I looked away to write something down in the log, I felt that something had changed. I looked at the body again, and, for a moment, it seemed to me that his arm was not in the same position. I stared at it for a few seconds and tried to convince myself that I had simply moved it without realizing it. It wouldn't be the first time that I did things automatically out of routine, but as the night went on, every time I walked away for a few minutes and came back, I had the feeling that the body had moved a little more. It wasn't much, just small variations in position, but enough to make me doubt. To be sure, I decided to check the security camera recordings. Everything in the morgue was recorded, so if I had moved it without realizing it, the camera would show it. I rewound the video and saw exactly what I had done. Everything seemed normal until I left the room. That's when I saw it. Every time I left the room, the body moved just a little, but it moved. They were not post-mortem spasms, it was not a reflex. The way he changed position was too precise, as if someone was adjusting him. The worst was when I advanced the video frame by frame. At one point when I left, for several minutes I saw a shadow. It wasn't clear, just a blurry silhouette leaning over the corpse. There was no one else in the morgue, there was no one else in the hospital who had access to that area. The only card registered that night had been mine. I stood there motionless, staring at the screen, my stomach in knots. The shadow. It would stay there as if it were doing something to the body and then disappear just before I went back in. I tried to reassure myself that it could be a reflex, a mistake in the recording, but the feeling in my chest told me otherwise. I went back to the room where the corpse was and stared at it, looking for anything out of place, and found something I'm 100% sure wasn't there before. Marks on the neck. I'm absolutely sure because I would have noticed them at the first checkup. They were depression marks, as if someone had tried to suffocate him. My heart was beating so hard I felt like I was going to faint. I'd seen thousands of corpses in my life, bodies in every possible state, but I'd never seen one that changed like that after death. I wanted to do something, check the file again, make sure I wasn't losing my mind, but all I did was close the cold room and walk away from there and didn't come near it again until my shift was over. The next day passed until I went back to my shift and ran into him. Forensic pathologist, whom I greeted normally, expecting to receive the same answer, but he asked me if everything had been okay last night. I told him yes. Why did he ask? And he replied, there was an error in the information about the body. The reason for his death was not due to an accident when he fell down the stairs, as the report said. The man was suffocated. To this day I do not know exactly what happened. They never found a culprit, because there were no footprints or clues of any kind that showed the presence of another. The person always asked me if someone alive actually made those marks on him or if someone or something finished killing him after he was dead. What torments me the most is thinking that maybe it was not the first time something like that happened. How many bodies have I received without noticing that they were not really alone?